Hello everybody! So how up to date are your .NET test projects for .NET 10? This is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. Well, personally, I must admit I've done the bare minimum on my test project. Never change a winning system, or rather a working system, right? As long as something works, don't change it, right? Well, sometimes changes, however, are still necessary in order for things to evolve to the next stage. Microsoft introduced MTP, or the Microsoft.Testing.Platform, somewhere in 2024. It has since become the recommended and more native option of running tests in .NET. MTP is embedded in your test projects, where test executables become the runners, removing the need for any external application dependencies, which seems nice. MTP is open source, but technically VSTest was also open source. However, MTP represents the future direction of testing within the .NET ecosystem. MTP is generally optimized for better performance and provides richer diagnostics and logging compared to the older VSTest. And MTP uses the modern JSON RPC-based protocol to communicate between the test runner and testing tools like Visual Studio Test Explorer. The first step that you need to do is to transform your project from a simple library to an executable. Simple, right? Next, the preferred way is to change the project type to specifically the MSTest.Sdk, and then you need to specify a version, rather than using the classical Microsoft.NET.Sdk. Now, this little change, of course, has some complications. The good thing about it is that you don't explicitly need to add MSTest as a NuGet package anymore. The downside, however, is that by specifying the version directly in your SDK type, that it's hard-coded, and that NuGet won't update to the latest version either. Now, the classical version with just using MSTest as a project package also works, so it's up to you. Let's dig in. So now I started up Visual Studio 2026 and I'm going to create a test project. So I choose Create Project and then I take my MSTest C# wizard, I choose Next, and then I can specify where I'm going to create it. And I'm first going to create my first test project. I choose Next, I choose .NET 10, and I'm going to take all default settings. I'm going to choose a test runner, Microsoft.Testing.Platform. As a coverage tool, I'm choosing Coverlet, and for now, I'm not creating any fixtures. Easy, right? And so it created a very simple test project with one dummy test class and one dummy test method. It created MSTest settings, which allows parallelize at method level. And if I have a quick look at first glance in my CSproj file, well, we can see that now we have an output type of executable. However, by default, the SDK type is still Microsoft.NET.Sdk and not out of the box the MSTest.Sdk. Let's create another one. Again, I choose New. I take the test project. I create a second one. And this time I'm choosing my coverage tools, not to Coverlet, but Microsoft Code Coverage. I choose Create. Again, my test class is exactly the same. My test settings are the same. And now the only difference is that I'm only including MSTest and no Coverlet compared to the previous where I had Coverlet. I'm choosing Test again. This is my third test project, and so this time I'm going to use the Microsoft Test SDK instead of the Microsoft.NET. And by choosing this, I have an extra option. I have the possibility to choose my extension profile. And here I have the choice between three different profiles. I have the default profile, I have the non-profile, and I have the All Microsoft. The default profile is the recommended profile where you have still already a number of extensions included, but not everything. When you go for the non-profile, you're in a very minimalistic configuration where you remove all the bells and whistles, but still have a working unit test. And then the All Microsoft profile is a profile that includes a lot more Microsoft-related extensions to give you a complete suite of Microsoft testing capabilities. So let's first create a default one. I choose Create. Again, we have our simple test project. We have our MSTest settings. And if we now have a look at our CSproj, it's a lot different. Now my SDK is Microsoft.Sdk 401, and we have no packages included, compared to the previous one where we had to include our MSTest ourselves. Now let's create another one with another profile. We're going to create our fourth one. Again, we're using Microsoft Tests, and this time we're taking none, which is a minimalistic version. Again, we have our tests, we have our MS test settings. And if we have a look here, the only difference between this one and the previous one is that our testing profile here is to none, compared to the previous one where we did not specify our testing profile, meaning it's the default. And if you go back to the previous two, we're not even talking about a testing profile. Now let's create the latest version, test project 5. Now we're going to choose the all Microsoft. And again we have our tests class, we have our MS test settings. And if we now look at our CSproj, the only difference is that we have our testing extension all Microsoft. Easy, right? Now, of course, again, if you go back to the testing wizard, there are some more options available as well. We could choose as a test runner also VSTest, but we're making a video about the testing platform, so I won't go in there. And again, I can still change my coverage tools even when using the MS test. Now, of course, in general, everybody wants to do greenfield, right? Unfortunately, a lot more projects are brownfield and/or are still more or less current application that needs to evolve to the next step. So here's my test project for my project NuGet Updater package, which was still in the old way of doing. And in order to modify this, I need to tweak certain things. And so if I want to stay in the old ways using Microsoft.Net.Sdk, what I need to modify is to add the output type and to make an executable out of it. That's the first step. And then the next step is that I currently have a lot of testing. I need to remove that. I need to replace that by simply MSTest. So I just simply put MSTest. I remove the second one and I also remove the Microsoft.Net.Sdk. And then finally, I also need to remove or transform my coverlet MS build to my coverlet collector, or remove it altogether if I'm not using coverlet anymore. And so my isTest project is still required, and enable test runner is also still set to true. Pretty simple conversion, right? Now if I want to go all the way in and change to MSTest.Sdk 402, then I don't even need the output, I don't need the fact that it's a test project anymore, I don't need my enable test runner anymore, and I don't need to specify that it is in the package. And of course, I don't need to specify MSTest. But again, it's a matter of choice which one you prefer. And all in all, it's still quite simple migration, but it's a very manual process, which is quite error prone. In my first subject about .NET 10 in combination with MTP and VSTest, I had to manually create a Global.json. Now that I've converted my project to a full MTP-based project, I don't need this anymore, so I can safely remove the file. And if you look at the new projects which I've created, there's no Global.json either. Now let's have a look at our NuGet packages on our first test project. And if we look, well, we have MSTest, which is currently version 4.02, and the wizard creates version 4.01. So we only have the NuGet test included here. We can easily upgrade it using NuGet packages. Simple, right? And it's done. The second project is more or less comparable, but without having coverlet. So again here, we can just upgrade it. The next three projects, however, are not anymore Microsoft.Net.Sdks, but are MSTest.Sdk 401. And now, technically, we have no NuGet packages whatsoever. So let's look at NuGet and see what happens. And here somehow, it seems a little bit more tricky. Under the hood, of course, MSTest is using MSTest test adapter and MSTest test framework. And here it shows us three options which we can still upgrade. So let's give that a shot and see what happens now. If we go now in, even though we specified MSTest 401, it manually upgrades the MSTest adapter and the MSTest framework to 402. And it also updates MS testing extension TRX to 202. So there's a little bit of a quirk, and we still have upgraded some of the packages, but not all. Now just let's revert and let's remove those three packages and see what happens if I just simply put it in MSTest 402. Well, my build still works. And if I now have a look at our updates, suddenly there's no updates anymore. So as I stated in my initial introduction, NuGet behaves a little bit different. And so from my point of view, the best option would be to update the SDK version. But that's a more manual thing to do. And the way Microsoft solved it is to add extra updated packages specifically in the project file, but they should have updated specifically the SDK to 402. And that's not happening. So now let's have a look at Visual Studio and a new MTP. First of all, for this to work, you need Visual Studio 17.12, and technically you can already do it on .NET 9, since this has been introduced in 2024. .NET 10 does require Visual Studio 2026, and my demos are done in Visual Studio 2026. Under the hood, the testing project went from a library to an executable. And so, if I now enable my test project as a starter project, I can just run my unit tests like this. And the executable is running. Pretty nice, right? Communication-wise, the way Visual Studio now communicates with your test project is to JSON, but we don't really see that. If you look at our Test Explorer, we still have all our tests. And we can just use run all tests and they'll execute as normally. Not much of a difference, right? According to the new specification, apparently there would be no automatic test discovery. And that means in order for Visual Studio to detect a new test, you first need to build. However, at first playing around, I did not really see that. And even without explicitly rebuilding, the test just popped up. But maybe behind the hood, automatically a build is done for me. So as you can see, just by saving, my test still pops up. It isn't run, but that is again default behavior. Other than that, there's not much difference between the VS Test way and the new MTP way. Now, one of the reasons to switch over to the MTP platform is also to open up more extensibility of the existing testing system. And if you go to NuGet and you type in Microsoft.Testing.Extension, you have already a whole lot of extensions which are available. And if you would need another one, you could just write one yourself in an easy way. But we won't dig into that here in this video. If I first connect to an older test configuration, which is still in mixed MTP and VS Test, just running .NET Test Help gives you the information on top, first of all, that it's running .NET Test command for VS Test and not for the MTP platform. And also, it's quite fast and it's static. If I now do the same thing on a new test which is migrated to the MTP platform, as you'll see here, it is taking more time. It is compiling. And the first part of the help is clearly stating that here we're using Microsoft.Testing.Platform. And as you've already seen, there's what we call the extensions. And depending on what you added, basically the MSTest and or potentially other extensions, depending on that, you might have more extensions available. So currently out of the box, we already have code coverage, we have crash dumps, we have hang dumps, we have report TRX, etc. If you remember, the test 5 was using the full Microsoft profile. If we do the same in our test project 4, which is a minimal profile, we'll see different behavior. And as you can see here, for our extensions, suddenly we don't have any code coverage anymore. We don't have any transactions anymore, etc. And so depending on what you've added as extensions and the type of profile you chose, parameters available for your tests are quite different. If we run it on the default, well, it's a little bit more previous. We still have code coverage and TRX reporting, but we have less than the full. Now if we're back in our test project 3, which has the default settings for our testing, we could manually add the Microsoft.Testing.Extensions.retry. So let's install this. Here we go. And now that's installed, if we look back, we can see that in our test 3, currently we have code coverage and we have transaction reporting. And now if I rerun it, suddenly we'll have some extra retry information. And here you can see we have retried for test failed, etc. And so depending on what you choose as type of extensions, you can add whatever you need and or remove if you don't need them. And these of course now will be important on our CI pipelines. First we configure locally, and afterwards our CI pipeline may that be Azure DevOps or something else, we just need to specify the parameters and it executes our testing project immediately with all of those parameters. Quite easy, right? And finally, let's have a run command line. The most simple is just typing .NET run. It'll take whatever it's in at location. And so as you can see, I have one test and it succeeded. Pretty simple, right? Now, for those who've seen my previous videos about the initial video with the combination with VS Test and MFT and the Azure DevOps troubles around it, well, I'm finally able to rebuild after migration to a new correct command line that I can afterwards run on my Azure DevOps. And here I have my .NET Test, I have my -- project, my project name, I specify a results directory, I want coverage output, my coverage file is cobertura, and if we give it a run, well, I have my TRX file and I have a coverage file. Pretty simple, right? And of course, the next step is just to build whatever you exactly need for your test to be running in your Azure DevOps pipelines or any other CI pipeline. Well, this is still a relatively minor change. It's just changing the project settings and the references, and not the unit test itself, which is quite good. This will also fix the issues with Azure DevOps, with the code coverage and TRX, but I'll create another video about that. If you guys enjoy this content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign, or leave a comment down below.